The delimitations of the study are normally found in Chapter 1 following the limitations of the study section or heading that you have created for your chapter. This is usually found near the end of the chapter, and it provides information that's critical for the reviewer to know, in particularly the audience who reads your work later once it's published, to have an understanding of the parameters that you put upon your own work. Limitations or the boundaries the researcher puts on their study. There tends to be a lot of confusion early on with doctoral students about what's the difference between limitations and delimitations. Limitations, as described in the lesson on that heading titled Limitations of the Study, provide the inherent limitations that a study has that has nothing to do with the researcher, him or herself, but it's there regardless of who does that same type of research. Here, delimitations are not necessarily inherent in the study, but they are the limitations or the boundaries that the researcher decides to put on the research study. And therefore, it can be subjective, and I'll talk a little bit about that in another item. But the difference mainly being is that limitations are inherent, whereas delimitations are chosen by the researcher. The delimitations helps to scope the study to be manageable. You may not have the opportunity or the need to survey every teacher in every high school in the state of New York. You may want to only look at the high school teachers in one city and in one district in New York. This way, you're able to have a sample size be representative of the whole. So it helps to scope down the work. Same as if you were doing research of all the nurses in a hospital. If you're only focusing on the intensive care unit, well, then you would scope it or delimit only to the intensive care nurses for the situation that you're looking at, because you may want to just focus on that certain area because that's the specialty or that's the problem that you're looking at trying to generate data for to produce information to help improve that area. The researcher controls these as compared to the inherent limitations. Again, these are the delimitations that you will decide what's best for your research. And because you are deciding what's best for your research, they may be different than everybody else's. And the reason we have this delimitation section is to allow you to explain why you are delimiting or scoping your work to a certain group of people so that we can better understand the rationale for your choices. The delimitations are in part related to the research method and design. It's going to be how you are applying your research method and design, because many different people could have different ways of applying a qualitative phenomenological study. We want to know exactly what it is you're doing so we can relate to it. In particular, with this section, like other sections in Chapter 1, you have to consider the audience who's going to read your work once it's published. Now, I understand while you're in the sense or the time frame of drafting it, it's hard to understand who's going to read your work 2 or 3 years from now, or maybe even 40 years from now. But think about the work that you have read of other people's research, and as you read these areas, and particularly delimitations, if you look at a few others, you'll get a sense for what they did and, more importantly, why they did what they did. And that's what we're trying to build into your work so that when it's published, you have a full document that explains not only what you did, but why you did what you did. Delimitations are also related to the situation or the unit analysis, as well as those not selected. As I mentioned, if you're going to do a survey of high school teachers in the state of New York, this relates to that situation, that unit of analysis, if you will, of the high school teachers in New York. Now, if you're going to narrow it down to one school or one district, well, then that helps us to understand why others were not selected. Perhaps you work in the district and you know in your district there's problems there. Another example I might share with you here is that if you look at small business failures in the United States, Within 2 years, the average rate of failure is 50%. However, in Denver, Colorado, the failure rate in the same 2 years is 56%. So if one was going to do research on why the national average is exceeded in Denver, one would be doing perhaps the unit of analysis in Denver, and the reason they're not selecting others, perhaps even in other cities, is that their statistics are not what relates to Denver. And so therefore you're sharing why you're doing the research and also giving some indication perhaps why you're not selecting other people who are not relevant. It may seem to make sense that you would be not surveying other people in Denver area, such as a suburb, but the reality is that when data is collected, it's collected for Denver, Colorado, because they would only have zip codes for the businesses that failed in Denver proper, not including the suburbs. The delimitations reflects the discerning critical thinking skills that you have for the choices you have made. Throughout your doctoral journey, you have been learning more about critical thinking, how to apply critical thinking skills. And the discerning critical thinking skills are what is critical to be displayed throughout your dissertation. That's why, much like the limitations, it helps the reader to understand better what you were thinking about and what you understood when you did your research. So therefore, the delimitations is another opportunity for you to share your discerning critical thinking skills and how you articulate the choices you have made. Ideally, there'll be one, maybe two if they're related, delimitations per paragraph. Now, depending on the complexity of your study, that may determine how many different paragraphs you need in the delimitation section. I have had mentees that have had one full paragraph. That's 3 to 7 sentences because there were not that many delimitations needed to be shared. However, I've had others who have had 4 or 5 different paragraphs only for the delimitations that were related to the study. I will also share with you that some people have 1 or 2 paragraphs when in fact they could have 4 or 5 paragraphs if they really wanted to go into depth. It's been my experience based on the dissertations that I've worked with and read over the years is that those who win the awards of perhaps the quantitative or qualitative dissertation of the year at a university are those that are the most complete. One of my mentees, whose example I'll share with you later in this lesson, from Dr. Joe Hagee, he won the Quantitative Dissertation of the Year award at the University of Phoenix in 2013. His dissertation is complete in every aspect, and some may say there's too much information, but it gives the reader the chance to get a better understanding what the researcher did, what the researcher went through, and the rationale for his choices. And I believe that's one of the foundational reasons why his dissertation was the dissertation of the year. Now, delimitations are subject to the researcher. I could go about doing the same exact research study as you, but I may do it differently. I may put a few different delimitations on it. I may not even consider some of the ones that you did because I don't have your experiences or your background. So this is important to know that when you write this section out, the reason why we want to see the rationale for your choices is because it is so subjective. If I don't understand why you did something, it opens up the door to question how well did you do your work. And we don't want that to happen. So as you work with your doctoral dissertation chair and other committee members, if they're asking you a lot of questions or why you're doing something, that's a good indication to you that you haven't explained well enough your individual choices, because it is subjective. They may not understand otherwise. The delimitations does reflect the knowledge and the method of the design that the researcher has. If there's only 1 or 2 delimitations in a complex study, it makes one wonder to what extent does one really know their research method and design. The more information you can share about why you've chosen your qualitative phenomenological study as compared to a qualitative case study is helpful because the delimiting factors helps one to understand that you're looking perhaps at a very narrow focus as compared to a case study, which might be more robust and more different opinions coming in from different stakeholders. The delimitations offers what the researcher will do, and importantly, what the researcher is not going to do. Now, when you're writing your proposal, you're writing in a sense of future tense, but when you do the dissertation, the study has been completed, and therefore the delimitation sections may change some based on what actually happened. Same as the limitations of the study section. Oftentimes, once the research is done, the author has to go back and revise these sections to exactly what happened. This section allows the researcher to indicate why they're doing a certain population or why they're doing something, but importantly also why not. In the case of the high schools in New York, you might want to indicate that if there's a problem only in one district, there's no reason to include high school teachers from other districts because the research or the report that was produced or the problem is only inherent in the one district. If you just said you were going to research high school teachers in one district without explaining why you're excluding the others, it leaves the door open for somebody to wonder why. Tell me more. I don't understand what happened. And that's exactly what we don't want to have happen. We want to make sure that every door is closed, that every time we state what we're going to do or what we're not going to do, that we provide the rationale for it. Think of it this way. Think of it that you wrote your proposal. Now, for some reason, you cannot do the research. Somebody else has to pick up your work, the 3 chapters, and read it and do the research the exact same way you would, knowing exactly why you would have done what you would have done. In that case, you can start to see the level of details that are needed in your work for somebody else to be able to pick it up without making some wrong assumptions of what the process should be, as you would do it. I want to share some of the possible people concerns that delimitations might address. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's enough for the common dissertation student that I believe will give you enough information to move forward or to help you better refine what you already have. The first one is who to involve and who not to involve. I gave an example about that in New York, but these are things that deal with the people. We want to know who you have decided is your survey population. For example, for me, when I did my research study on the cause and effect of a corporate fitness center, what I was able to do is find an organization that had about 1,500 employees. Only about half of those employees, roughly 700 of them, were actually using the fitness center. But to use the fitness center, they had to have gone through a screening and signed a form that said they understand how to use the equipment. In my case, I was able to work with only those 700 people because those were the only ones from the whole company of 1,500 employees who could actually use the fitness center. So I knew that those I wanted to be included in my survey sample were going to be those people who had gone through that screening and had signed that form. There was no reason for me to include the other people because they were not users of the fitness center. So I was able to substantiate why my survey population was the qualification being that they have signed that form and they are registered users of the fitness center. But I also described that I did not include the others because they did not have that signed form and therefore they were not actual users of the corporate fitness training program. So therefore, for me, if I would have surveyed everybody in the company, I would have had false readings because not everybody was using the fitness center. The unit of analysis oftentimes deals with the people on who you decide. For example, if you decide you're only going to survey the natal intensive care unit hospital nurses as compared to the entire staff of nurses for a large trauma center hospital, we want to know why, and we want to know who you have narrowed down your study to. Who have you delimited to? You have delimited, instead of doing the whole hospital, you have delimited it to the unit of analysis of the Naval Intensive Care Unit nurses, much like in the case of the teachers in New York, you have narrowed it down. You have decided to not do all the teachers in the whole state. You decided only the high school teachers in a certain district in the state of New York. The location for research can be conducted depending on where you're going to be. You might delimit it down to a certain location for your research to be conducted. If, in the example of Denver, Colorado, having a higher percentage of businesses that fail as compared to the national average, then the location that you have decided would be businesses in Denver, Colorado. Now, you may also delimit it farther to technology-based, or perhaps it's home-based businesses. It depends on where you want to delimit the study based on the literature that you found. And that's a good point to bring out here. In many cases, the delimiting factors are given to you in some cases by the literature. You wouldn't guess at these things. You would actually use literature to support some of the delimitations, the narrowing, or the boundaries that you're placing on your study. The delimitations could be the vehicle and how you collect your data. Let's just say, for example, you decided that you're going to do interviews and you're going to use Skype. Well, that's a delimiting factor because not everybody has a Skype account. Not everybody uses Skype. So you are therefore automatically taking out anybody who could have been part of the survey population, but they didn't have a Skype account, so they could not be. And so what you would be indicating here, perhaps that you're going to use Skype. Maybe you're also doing phone interviews, or you're actually doing face-to-face interviews. If it's more than one of these vehicles, that's fine. You would just indicate that you are delimiting your data collection to people who can meet with you face-to-face, on the phone, or on Skype. That could mean some people cannot be part of that group. And that's what this is all about, to determine how you have decided to narrow your certain survey population, or delimiting those who can be in that population and who cannot be. Now, there's possible research method and design concerns as well that go along with delimitations. This is why, in many cases, I believe too many doctoral students don't put enough information in the delimitation section. They look at it as something that's quick and easy, a paragraph or two, and they move on. And if a paragraph or two is all you need to move on, that's great. But in many instances, perhaps a few more is needed. The choice of the research method and design. You may decide that you want to do a qualitative phenomenological study. Whereas perhaps if I was doing it, I may want to do a quantitative correlation study. Both of them could be appropriate, depending on the situation, of course. But what we want to know is, what are the limiting factors that you have put on by doing this? So when you decide to do the qualitative phenomenological study, you realize that delimiting it to that precludes getting many different self-reporting surveys that you might have gotten otherwise if you did the quantitative correlation design. Same as if you decided to do that phenomenological study as compared to a case study, you have delimited to a very narrow view, the lived experiences of perhaps 20 people on a very specific phenomena, as compared to maybe doing a case study which could have given you robust input as you explored what that situation was or what that phenomena was from 4 or 5 different types of stakeholders. Doesn't mean that anything's right or wrong, and that's not what this is about. It's about you describing literally why you have chosen to do what you're going to do, or why you have already done what you've done if it's the dissertation itself that's already been ready for publication. The delimiting factors could deal with variables and research questions. You may realize that you only want to do 1 or 2 or 3 independent variables, therefore give you 3 research questions, as compared to somebody else who may decide that they wanted 6 variables and therefore 6 research questions. All we're asking you to do is describe why you have delimited down to the 3 independent variables, if that's how many you have. And ideally, that would be grounded in some aspect of the literature that suggests these are the 3 most important ones, as compared to perhaps the 8 or 9 that could have been there. The lens of the theoretical framework. Theoretical framework suggests where your work is grounded in. And this is important for the outside reader to know the lens that you are looking through. If, for example, we're wondering why people are not more efficient in the workplace, and therefore there's process problems of increased cycle time. If you're looking through the lens of Frederick Taylor, scientific management, you're probably going to be focusing more on how people are applying their knowledge and skills into a process. Whereas if somebody else is coming from it from a humanistic point of view or an HR perspective, they may be looking at perhaps how employees are trained. And therefore, the lens is important, and the delimitations here is that you're sharing the lens that you have not chosen and the lenses that you have chosen. This helps to ground your study. I would also see some reflection of this lens of the theoretical framework reflected in Chapter 2 in the literature that you have used, because your literature in Chapter 2 would be probably far more focused on the scientific management literature as compared to perhaps the more literature that's available for human behavior or employee performance type of literature. The delimitations might reflect to the research instrument chosen. You may have chosen a research instrument that has only 13 or 14 Likert type questions, whereas compared to another one that you may have used that would have had 60 questions. Sometimes people will use only part of a survey. I have a survey that I designed titled Supervisor and Leadership Communication Inventory. That being about 60 questions, I have had several researchers take out only 12 to 15 of those questions. They delimited the research that they did based upon only needing a certain amount of questions from my study, because my survey actually deals with not only leadership and communication but organizational behavior as well. And so therefore they only wanted the pieces on communication, and so they took those only. So they delimited rather than using the whole survey to only using part of the survey. Again, all we're asking for you to do is explain to us why, if that was you in that case, why you only took 12 questions out of the 60 questions that were available. We can't survey everybody about everything. That would be too hard. We have to remember that doctoral dissertation research is about doing the academic exercise to show that you understand research and how it can be done and what to do with the data once you have it. So as faculty members and dissertation chairs will often tell people early on is to narrow your topic, narrow it down, scope it down, be able to limit and delimit your work as you move through your process. Here's the exact same thing that we're looking for. Understand that with your dissertation, you're probably not going to be able to save the world, but you can certainly get some good information from some data that can help people to lessen the problem that you've identified. Some of the examples I want to share with you now are from my doctoral dissertation students who have graduated. They were my mentees. In most cases, their work was approved on the first time at the proposal in the dissertation because they were people who paid attention to details and really added enough detail into their work, whereas the dean didn't have to ask questions about it. Each of my mentees provided consent for me to use their work. They own the copyright. I'm just sharing it as examples to help you with their agreements. Dr. Maria Pointe, in the first example, her dissertation title is Selling: The Lived Experiences of Domestic Property and Casualty Insurance Leaders. In her section, titled The Delimitations of the Study, she opens it up with a little information and talks with a citation about what delimitations are, what the researcher is not going to do. As I mentioned, delimitations suggest what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. This study was delimited to managers and leaders in domestic property and casualty insurance organizations located in the metropolitan area of Puerto Rico who had 5 or more years of experience with the phenomena under study. So you can see she delimited down to only people that were in the metropolitan area of Puerto Rico, and she also delimited down to people who have had 5 or more years of experience. She didn't want somebody who had less than 5 years, because that means they would not have had a certain level of expertise that were needed to be able to qualify them to be part of the study. She also went on to say the geographical location represented delimitation. The participants were located in the metropolitan area of Puerto Rico. Notice how she, in the last paragraph and this one here, is very specific. No reason to use other words, just use the word delimiting or delimitation. Delimiting the participants to leaders of the insurance companies incorporated lessen the generalizability of the results to other countries and cultures. What she's saying is, because she narrowed down, she chose this group of people, it may not be data that can be inferred elsewhere. Similarly, interviewing only property and casualty executive level leaders lessen the generalizability to within that industry, meaning that other industries, this may not be as valid or appropriate for making the same kind of conclusions from the data. Dr. Ellen Beatty, she, in her dissertation titled A Quantitative Correlation Study, Institutional Characteristics and Endowment Investment Performance Following the 2008-2009 Financial Crisis, in her delimitation section, she goes in and says, the delimitations of this current study included the choice to use only institutions that participated in 2010 National Association of College and University Business Officers Common Fund Study endowments. Only those that participated. This choice excluded for-profit institutions, institutions that choose not to participate in the 2010, and institutions that do not include endowments in their funding structure. So you can see she made choices of who to be in her study and who cannot be in there, and she described it. That's what she decided the limitations were for her own work. That's why they're called delimitations. She goes on to say in her work, a second delimitation was the choice of independent and dependent variables. Variables not relevant to the study purpose or variables deemed not measurable in a quantitative study were eliminated. So she's helping you to understand here that not every variable that could have potentially been in her work is, that there's a choice and a rationale for why some are not. Dr. Joe Hagee, in his dissertation titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study, has a number of limitations that he wrote to. The study was delimited to conducting a survey of leaders and organizations operating in Lebanon. So you can see automatically he's doing a study in Lebanon, so therefore it's not going to be in every case have data that's going to be inferred to other places outside of Lebanon. The study was focused solely on the relationship between religion, religiosity, and leadership practice in the workplace. Christianity and Islam were the focus religions of study. Here he goes on to say other religions that some Lebanese organizational leaders adhere to were excluded from the analysis. So if the survey population were not of Islam or Christianity faith, they were not included in the study. Dr. Joe Hagee goes on to share in the next section the use of the well-established leadership practices inventory survey and the religious practices inventory instruments to deliver this study's analysis and conclusions was another delimitation of the study. The sample of participants was delimited to those who had email addresses and internet access. So we can see here he delimited down to the use of these two survey instruments, as well as helping us to understand that some of the participants were delimited to email addresses. If they didn't have an email address, they couldn't be part of the study. The study was delimited to specific variables identified. Other intervening variables may have been accounted for. Other factors that may contribute to leadership practice were not researched. So he's basically just giving you some information here that there were other potential variables he could have considered and that he just used what he used. The study was delimited to analyzing the leadership practices of organizational leaders from the points of view of the leaders only and did not include their followers' point of view. So as you can see, his study was delimited to only leaders from their points of view. He didn't do perhaps what some people might have done and received more of a 360-degree type of feedback, or included other people, where he just included the leaders of the organization. He also indicated that the limitations were geographically located of the sample, because the sample was extracted only from the country of Lebanon. The study is delimited by the disproportionate ratio of the size of the sample to the population sample of Lebanon, indicating that if you saw how many different surveys came back, you'll understand that it may not be a true representation of the entire country. In the fourth example, Dr. Patricia Schroeder shares in her dissertation a quantitative correlation study of individualism, collectivism, and employee innovation in Turkey. She goes in her work to say the study was delimited to employees attending either Karaka Language School of Turat Orzel University who self-reported working for the public or private organizations in Turkey. She's very clear, and she says this study was delimited to. This is a great way to write your own work. Don't try to beat around the bush, as the phrase may be. Just get straight to the point. She goes on in another paragraph and gives more information. Additionally, the results were delimited to data collection of Hofstede's Value Survey module, the supervisor leadership communication inventory, and Likert type questions used to measure self-reporting, creativity, and innovation. So she was saying here that she used certain tools. I was fortunate that she actually used mine, the leadership and communications inventory that Dr. Ruby Rouse and I created, and that certainly helped me give her a perspective in her dissertation work. And the final example I want to share with you is from Dr. Susan B. Kristiniak, which is titled Exploring the Experiences of Complementary Therapy Nurses, a Qualitative Phenomenological Study. In her delimitations, she starts it out, delimitations occurred within the selected study organization and the population participating in the current research study. The introduction of complementary therapies for use in patient care, although not restricted from other organizations, was studied in a single environment, indicating that she did her research in a single environment, in a single hospital healthcare setting. She didn't go to different hospitals, perhaps in the same city or the same region. It's just from one single environment. The study sample was restricted to convenient sample. Here she's helping us to understand that the approach she used is a convenient sample. Now, if you understand research, you do that good consumer research, you understand now how the delimitations not only deal with the people, but of the research method and design. And so she goes on to say of nurses based on the completion of their education in complementary therapies and their integration of these therapies in the patient care practice. The sample size was selected that represented a practical approach and allowed for a completion of research study. That means she was able to do a reasonable group of people, and it was within the bounds, perhaps, of the research studies titled her doctoral dissertation. She wasn't trying to save the world or do something too big. She was trying to get a snapshot of what was going on in that situation. She also did well here. I like the way she added information here. The data collection was delimited to participations' responses collected in a single point of time versus a collection of attitudes and opinions over a longitude timeline, meaning that it was a one-time shot. Now, if she was going to do this again 2 months from now, 3 months from now, 4 months from now, then as each study was done from that point forward, she would show that it was longitudinal. It was information that was collected over time, and we could then compare it based on different time situations. Time constraints did not support a more rigorous exploration. What she's indicating here is that the essence of her research, a doctoral dissertation research study, didn't allow her 6 months or 12 months to be able to collect data or to explore this phenomena to a greater level. All she's indicating is the reality of which you are all under, that there are some time constraints for the study that you're doing because you want to graduate, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, you don't necessarily have to mention it in your work, but she decided to because she thought it was important. What the differences are between limitations and delimitations, and how to craft that section in your proposal and dissertation.